All right, so let's get started. Thank you all so much for coming here to our session today. It's so lovely to be here in person. I know that every single presenter this week is going to be saying that, but we're at the beginning, so maybe it's not old yet. Thank you all for coming. If we haven't met, my name is Anna. I'm a policy analyst at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Basically, that means that I take a lot of time looking at federal grants for disaster risk reduction and figuring out where the money goes and who gets it and who doesn't get it and who probably should get it instead. And in particular, my work focuses a lot on home buyout projects and how to improve them so that they go as smoothly as possible and create real benefits for residents and communities. So our session this afternoon will be in 3 parts. First, I'm going to spend a few minutes introducing you all to our project. Last year, our team conducted 2 series of workshops, one for buyout practitioners who have professional experience working on home buyout projects, and one for buyout participants who have gone through a buyout themselves or experienced a project happening in their community. So after I give you this short background, we will hear from a panel made up of participants from our 2 workshop series, as well as our project team. And then in the second half, we will break into small groups for everyone to discuss their observations, experiences, and recommendations in this area. I guess our goal really with this work is to start small and expand out into a network of people who can all share and learn from each other. And we're, I guess, mirroring that format in our session here today. So let's get started. There we go. So if you know me, you may have seen this slide before. I use it a lot, but just in case, I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea behind a home buyout. It makes a lot of sense, at least on paper, right? You get homeowners who are tired of getting flooded and they volunteer to sell their home to a public body like the local town or the county. The person gets to go live somewhere safer and the land is preserved as open space to absorb floodwaters and maybe even provide some sort of additional public benefit, right? But in reality, we all know that a buyout project is highly complicated and often takes a really long time. And at the same time, even when community members desperately want to leave their flood damaged homes, there aren't always safer homes to move to, at least not for the amounts that government grants are willing to pay or on the timeframes that actually make sense for people's lives. Buyouts sit at the intersection of disasters and housing. And in that way, they interact with all of the complex issues and inequalities that exist in both of those systems. And they can both compound existing inequities and also create new problems, taking what might be the worst experience of someone's life and adding another disaster on top. But at the same time, more and more people want or need to move. And the bottom line here is that our current process can't even deal with current need and demand, let alone scaling up to larger scopes and overcoming the barriers associated with more complex situations, let alone centering equity and justice amid the massive devaluing of flood-prone properties in neighborhoods that have already faced decades of discrimination and disinvestment. In many cases with buyouts, we're still struggling to get the easy cases right. Before we go further, I do want to note that I want to make it clear that I'm not advocating for buyouts. Personally, I tend to think that the best buyout is one that never has to happen. But I do want to advocate for better buyouts, ones that work for residents and for local governments. I also want to emphasize before we go any further that home buyouts are not managed retreat. At least not how they're currently done and not on their own. They're a narrow solution to a narrow aspect of the climate adaptation problem. And we can't just take this specific type of a hazard mitigation project and make it into a broad climate migration solution. However, they did still let us into this conference, probably because buyouts are currently the country's primary tool to help people move out of harm's way. And for better or for worse, they're a fundamental component of the ways that we're likely to think about larger scale climate-driven relocation in this country. So that brings us to our project. Here at NRDC, we've been working on issues related to buyouts for several years, and in that time, there has been an explosion of interest and research in this topic. And there's lots of great ideas out there that people are kicking around about how to improve buyouts. But we've noticed that many of these ideas are only that. They're ideas that haven't yet been put into practice, or maybe they're real tried and true approaches, but they've only been done in one location. Nobody else has heard about them. So our goal with this project was to take those ideas to the next level, moving from, well, what if we try this, to specific actions that actual people can take. And we wanted to make sure that we included voices, not just from people who work on buyouts as their jobs, but those who are living through the process as buyout participants and community leaders. So we teamed up with our wonderful project team, who you'll meet in a bit, to host the 2 sets of workshops that I mentioned at the beginning. This map shows the locations that our workshop participants represent, blue for the practitioners and pink for the community members. We had about a dozen buyout recipients and community leaders and over 30 practitioners from all around the contiguous United States. We deliberately convened these 2 workshop series separately, at least for this first stage, because we wanted an environment where participants felt comfortable sharing among their peers, but that also let us then afterwards synthesize the information and allow the 2 groups to be in conversation with each other's ideas. While we started the practitioners' workshops with this goal of discussing specific ideas, the conversations ended up taking a broader view, really digging into the underlying structures and capacity needs to set these projects up for success at the local level. We found that in many cases, local governments are thinking about buyouts as individual projects with a beginning, middle, and an end, the same way that you would approach a flood wall or some other kind of structural intervention. But with buyouts, you aren't just building something. You aren't even just unbuilding something either. You are shaping the future of your community, and you're doing it in a way that has massive financial, emotional, and social implications for everyone who is involved. So in places where there's a lot of need or desire for relocation support, our workshop participants emphasize the importance of a sustained program, not just a project. What you need is a structure that allows you to plan ahead, complete as much work as you can before a disaster hits, and be ready to plug in sources of funding when they're available at a time and in the places that meet the community's specific needs. Easy, right? Of course, that isn't to say that every small town or rural county needs to be able to do this, right? In some places, whether it's for political or administrative reasons or for climate and risk reasons, there's no reason to spend all that time and effort standing up a program that you won't need going into the future. But that also shouldn't mean that when you do have to do buyouts that you're starting from scratch and go it alone. Instead, the institutional support that you need could sit at the watershed, county, or state level, for example. So the 5 shifts that are listed on this slide summarize the recommendations from our practitioners' workshops in support of this key goal, institutional support. We do have a written document that explains each of these in more detail, along with policy changes that could help make them happen. But the key ideas here focus on building holistic programs that incorporate and allow for advanced planning, as well as attention to all of the needs that come along with a buyout beyond just buying and selling some properties. So perhaps unsurprisingly, there really was a lot of consistency between these recommendations and the ones, the ones made by the participants in our community members workshop. So we started our buyout participants and community leaders sessions with storytelling, both so that we could learn from everyone's stories and also as a way to build trust around this deeply personal topic. But even at the very beginning of this story sharing process, people were naming specific policy recommendations that would either address the challenges that their communities faced or expand the good parts of the programs that they were part of. So in addition to practical considerations around compensation and communication, many of these discussions touched on ways to incorporate lived experience into government-run programs. For example, consistent and compassionate case management is often pointed to as something that improves buyout participants' experiences. Where do you find those case managers? What if that support or something like it was actually provided by someone who has gone through the process themselves and has decided to share their wisdom and support with others in their position? I specifically also want to point to the final item on this list, which is the importance of taking actions not just to improve buyouts for future participants, but to avoid putting those people in harm's way in the first place. Basically, governments showing that they've learned their lesson. And in addition to making buyouts better, taking steps to reduce future risk for the whole community. So throughout this whole process, we did want to make sure that we weren't just identifying suggestions for individual buyout programs, but also thinking about what needs to change in a bigger way on the state or federal policy level to make these changes possible. And these, again, are described in our written materials, which I hope that you will all read and enjoy. But there's really a focus on how the federal government can remove barriers to local action. And these are sort of summarized here, but the final point that I want to emphasize is this last box, which I think has emerged as one of the most consistent and important recommendations from both sets of our workshops. We hear from everyone that we talk to that home buyouts are often a very isolating experience, certainly and understandably for the residents who are going through selling their home and moving, but also for program staff who might find themselves thrust into a complicated project that they have no experience with and they have no relevant examples or institutional memory to draw from. I mean, ideally, if you're doing a buyout project, you know, your location has never done one before. And if you do it right, you'll never do one again. But that doesn't mean that you have to be alone. There's no reason why that has to be the case. There are so many stories and lessons and just interpersonal support that we could all be taking advantage of and using to make this experience better for everyone. The poet, Bob Hickok, has this like really charming piece about his home state, which ends with the lines, "Let us all be from somewhere. Let us tell each other everything we can," which sounds simple, but I think it's a powerful statement as a reminder of what we all have to contribute and also a call to action as we build a network of people with both lived and learned experience to connect the dots between each other's stories and also build a network of support so that no one living or working through a buyout project feels like they're doing it alone. So with those principles in mind, we can move on to the next part of our program. This is your chance, not your last chance, but a chance to grab the link for our project website, which also directs you to our written reports. And the second QR code there is like a direct link to the project folder with those written materials. I'm going to leave this up as I do some introductions. So, like I said, we're going to move into a panel now. And so I'm going to introduce our panelists and our project team. We actually have a whole bunch of really great people here today, both in person and on Zoom, because technology is magical. First, I want to introduce Carrie Hewlett, who's our panel moderator. Carrie, wave your hand. Thank you. Carrie is a collaboration practitioner who runs her own consulting practice and has been involved in conversations about relocation due to climate change for over 7 years. We reached out to her 2 years ago to help us develop and facilitate this workshop project. Carrie is the only person I know who in the course of one phone call can provide expert facilitation, life advice, as well as the best recommendations for instant noodles. Do we have Terry on the line? All right, I'll skip Terry then. Joe Tyrone. Joe, there's Joe. Joe is joining us as a member of our buyout participants workshops. Joe worked with his community in Oakwood Beach and Staten Island to relocate after Superstorm Sandy. He's here today to share some insights from his community's experience with buyouts, as well as his participation in our community member dialogues. Jose Regalado, over there, is joining us to represent the over 30 managers and other staff from city and state buyout programs who participated in our practitioners dialogues. Jose is the assistant director of the building department in the city of Miami, Florida, and will share his views from the perspective of someone working in a large city with, shall we say, significant climate risk. Rounding out our panel on Zoom is Shamika Hansen from the Nature Conservancy, who's another one of our key partners in this work. And she'll talk a little bit about our process and why hearing from both lived experts and learned experts, so both the buyout recipients and the managers and staff, makes for a more robust set of recommendations, as well as the many considerations and design choices we made to convene both of the groups. And finally, I would also like to acknowledge and thank some of our team members who are not going to be on the stage with us today, but are day-to-day partners in this work, and we couldn't do it without them. Maggie Ostius and Kristen Marcel of the Climigration Network. You guys here, wave, thank you. Who partnered with us to support the buyout recipients workshops, as well as my colleague Rob Moore, Wave your hand, Rob, who actually had the original idea for this project and is a longtime advocate for smarter and fairer flood policy. So, all right, we're not going to do that yet. Instead, I'm going to hand it over to Carrie.
Thank you, Anna. And Joe and Jose, if you would like to come up. Well, thank you everyone for coming. I love a standing room only situation. This is pretty great, though I am sorry that you are all standing and 3 seats just got vacated. So feel free to come forward. There honestly, I can see like 7 or 8 open seats. So if you'd like to sit, just come by. Yeah, just come on up. Come on up. We're all very informal here, so come on up if you'd like. Can we get Shamika's video up as well? So we have Shamika and Jose and Joe here today to talk with us. And thank you. We are asking you today to do kind of some difficult mental work here. So I just want to lay it out for you. We're trying to put forward a few different ideas that we hope can be broadened to the broader buyout and managed retreat conversation. And one is, what is the perspective of municipalities and state agencies that are running these programs, and what do they need to do them better? So that's one set of ideas, and Jose is here to talk about that from the city of Miami's perspective in particular. The second set of ideas is, what do people who are moving need in order for these buyouts to be better for them? And Joe will be representing that perspective. And then as a third piece, why do we need the voices of both people who are what we're calling learned experts, or in this case, the managers and the staff of these buyout programs, and the lived experts, the people who through their personal experience are living through these really difficult decisions. And so when we go to small groups, I'm just teeing up for you that we will ask you to consider sort of different questions in each of those categories. So Shamika, do you want to just give a quick wave, Shamika, and just so, I mean, folks can see you, but there you are. Okay. So I'm going to pass it over first to Jose, and then to Joe, and then to Shamika to just say a bit about themselves so you learn a little bit about them before we do the questions. On your tables, most tables, there are some blank index cards and there should be some pens. If there's a question that you would like to put to the panel, please write it on the card. And then Maggie, who's right here, will just be kind of looking for anyone who wants to pass a card to her. We definitely will not get to all the cards, but we will be collecting these cards as part of this another phase of this project to understand what your questions are. So I apologize in advance, we won't get to all of them, but it will be worth writing them down anyway, because they will make their way into the follow-up on this work. So please write down your questions, and then we'll do as many as we can. And then the last thing I just want to say is, you'll note that Joe is here representing his personal perspective as a person who owned a property and led his community through a buyout. And of the 12 people who participated in our buyout recipients conversation, Joe is the only one who didn't live in the home that got bought out. The other 11 did. And the reason I'm noting it is just that there's a slightly different perspective of someone whose primary residence, right, got bought out and had to move. And we reached out to all of our buyout recipients. And I just want to note how incredibly difficult it is for people to join a conference in the middle of the day on a Tuesday. So many of Joe's colleagues from that buyout conversation wanted to join and just couldn't make it work, in spite of the fact that we offered compensation and tried to make sure that it was as easy as possible and could join online and all of those things. It is really hard for these people who leave their homes to participate in conversations like this. And we shouldn't forget that as we talk about combining lived and learned expertise. So I'm going to pass it to you first, Jose, and then to Joe, and then to Shamika.
Hello, everyone. Is this on?
Is it working?
On? Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, my name is Better Buyout. I'm the assistant director in the building department in the city of Miami. We regulate all permitting, including animal electric programs, which also kind of flat out into that. Relevant, really quick before I jump into kind of my biggest recommendation that I want to force out, despite not, being directed to do that. We have significant construction each year on coastline. So that's $3 billion of value of properties every year, year over year, and has been since 2007. So even through a lot of financial crisis, they just continue the building boom. And it's not slowing down. We continue to see what we call increase, which are we can forecast out in the next 5 years at least. There's no pitch. So on what I feel is the greatest, the most important thing from a bureaucracy on buyouts and for the improvement is the creating institution. And that can happen through the first one, which is legislate everything that's complete over and over again. That is the biggest cover that elected officials, residents, the power that residents have to hold people accountable, as well as people who work in the public service, they can relate to that and refer to that. Legislation is the key that can then lead to standard operating procedures that can then lead to feedback loops where you can create an you need to use the tools that you have to plan ahead. Right now in the city of Miami, we have integrated not necessarily buybacks, but we are identifying properties in our future land use plans, in our comprehensive planning to show what are the risks in 2040, 2050, 2070. What do we need to do? What requirements do you have when we build today to get that the risk that you will have in 2070? And that's the main thing that I have is this create an institution and outlast you as a public official and any other administration.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Joseph, and I am a real estate broker and investor. And I want to start this by saying that I've done a couple of these discussion panels, especially represented a couple of times. I've always been trying to figure out how can I organize my work so that's what I just don't know how I used to do it, try to spread that. So I said, I think about like an acronym. They want some kind of category so that I'll remember and so it gets something you know, that's not what presented and came up with it. It was called Getting House. Movie. A government enabled transition of being organized, united, and building trust. The views of but that's somewhat being organized, united, and building trust. And I participated in a conversation with the people that were in our country. And it was really interesting to see how it resonated with every single conversation, every single participant involved in that how hard it was to how you can trust them. So, you know, and I can tell you how I did it. It sounds so I did it. It was completely by accident. I was not intended to build trust, but it turned out that's what happened. If we continue the meeting that we had, I would get up in front of everybody and I would say, I am not a government official. I am not anyone here who has any other interest than I'm a victim like you are. I'm not a politician. Because you're like, who is this guy? Because this is a scientific community. The people whose generational, generational, and to a fact accepted. I would investor, so no one is changing it. You know, I would come, it was been tennis for 5 years, but I didn't get anywhere on the soul spot. So when I started my conversation with that, I'm like, okay, it's better, just follow these applications. But that was so, and I didn't do class every single time. And then eventually I had been initially ended up engaging members. And we met once a week right into the storm. For as many weeks we had community meetings every 3 weeks. And so I was able to, you know, I think what I was just amazing. So they started to be the community trusted me. So I was about to extraordinary how important it is to be being organized, united, and building trust. And really the NRDC very helpful. Then we want to have you here. And see around more, and I will get that person, but we're exposed many times. We go back and we some great years. And I've had a pretty successful relationship with the Compass, which is an nationwide real estate company. So I'm working for them, also investor. And I enjoyed the piece of that success. My most successful deal with actually highlighted what I did with DC Water. That's in this realtor, biggest deal with selling the neighborhood to the government, which is actually true, except that you make it one and it's not enough to make sure that there was a separation of that, make sure that when they found the loans, I just gave the brokers that they could deal with agents that could deal with the purchase of the loan. That's the forecast. And I was talking to every earlier about that because I was thinking about this morning. And I'm here not because of a realtor, I'm here because of my experience. I've never asked me to come to the world. And then rarely, maybe conversations, you see a realtor and not with this. And there's one reason for that. In some cases, you know, they're not trusted or whatever. Or it's just the same. And one of the things I was thinking when I was put out before this was there's so many reasons we look at management. Now, a lot of people studying what we did, and this was part of management program. What we managed studiously into the storm, and it's a series of miracles that allowed us in. Because all of the little things that had to happen. And I'm going to make this short, and then I'm going to go on forever again. But I just wanted to I forgot my thought. Verify. So all these things haven't happened. But how do you make that happen when you're talking about management? How do you do that? So one of the things I'm thinking about myself is they have to convince people. And it was scientific evidence about how dangerous it is. Right? It'll be up to you talk with all of them. So when you can talk about people to move, there needs to be a relationship with that community. And that's something that you go into because then there's something behind this that you really need to move out of here. And it's very compelling. That's why I'm sitting here because I believe it. But it's really hard to engage in the community and have the structure to say that. So maybe something like let's say that maybe that's one of the so I'm going to finish by saying that my introduction anyway is that one of the things about this miracle bias, everything that has to be in place was in place. In 2012, that's when the real estate market had leveled together with the 2008. So values had just stabilized. And so when people were given the possibility of having a what you call a 10% office, which is bigger. He was orchestrated unbelievably by having he was amazing, but his chief advisor was a guy named Jordan Kerber, who was that kind. So he used that out. He gave that 10%, and other parts in his office. So then they knew they wanted to have competition effort. And a year later, they were other than the horrible fallout of losing their home and beyond. Eventually, they were able to regulate the hospital and more. So that was important. Now it's told prices are at a high mortgage rates is another thing that we consider. Mortgage rates right now, we want to they're going to go over 3% mortgage rates. Then the lower cost of New York City, you have to consider that. So I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm here to help and collaborate with everyone to let you know that the real estate component is obviously the most important component here. And I'm here to help everyone. Thank you, Madam.
Great, Joe, thank you. Shamika, I'm just going to say one thing before you jump in, if you don't mind. I just want to say something about Joe's point about not being sort of from the community, being in the community. When it came time to organize around buyouts, Joe became part of that community, right? He became an advocate for the community, but he did have just enough distance. And the reason I want to note this is that the top recommendation that Anna already shared with you that came out of our buyout dialogue was that the people who had had a trusted guide through the process were the people who felt the most positive about the process. Now, in most cases, that trusted guide was from the buyout program. They were a case manager. In Joe's specific place, he became the case manager because that didn't exist previously, right? He sort of became the case manager for his own community. But that point of building trust with someone who cares and is deeply invested in the community, even if they're not from the community, is hugely important. It was, as we said, the top recommendation that came from the buyout recipients. So I just wanted to highlight it. All right, Shamika, you want to jump in and talk about the process a bit?
Yes, thank you. But before I start with that, just for the folks who are on Zoom, it is very hard to hear all of the other panelists. Carrie, you're coming in fairly clearly, but we barely heard what Joe was saying. So I think it's being worked on, but your mic seems to be working well for folks, just in case that helps. So thank you all. I hear it's a packed out room. Sorry I couldn't be there with you, but wanting to make sure that I am protecting my health as well as everyone else's. And so here to talk to you a little bit today about sort of how we design this program. You're hearing that we've had participants from not only learned experience, our practitioners, but as well as our lived experts, our recipients. And so you're seeing both represented here in the room today, but to get these two lovely people and all the others that participated in this process together was not necessarily the smoothest of rides. And it took a lot of partnership thinking, communicating with various people, and going back and changing some things as we were working together. And so thinking through some of the practitioner considerations that we had, these were contexts we really already had, but many are working, 9-to-5 jobs, can't really recommend things that are beyond the position or their current scopes of work, and really sort of don't always get the time or opportunity to look back on processes to create improvements or figure out ways that they could have done something differently. And so in our work, we were really working to not only build trust amongst ourselves as facilitators, but as well as between the various practitioners who already had sort of alignment in their work, but don't always get an opportunity to speak to one another. We made sure to really schedule things at times that were convenient for them. So ensuring that we were trying to keep within their work hours. And then really managing all of the communications going back and forth, that sort of tedious background work of keeping all the information together, documenting meetings, sharing notes out, keeping that group sort of aligned together as the process moved forward. When we thought about sort of the design choices and considerations for our lived experts, our recipients, that was vastly different. These were people who we did not necessarily have communication and contact with. These were people who were from communities we weren't necessarily a part of or really even had heard of maybe before. And so finding these recipients and people to speak to who had gone through this really emotional process previously was something Carrie and I and our project team really had to think through how to do. So I'd like to start by thanking, of course, the practitioners who recommended folks to us, let us know who we could contact, people who had given them permission to be reached out to while they were a part of the buyout program. But then aside from that, we had to get sort of creative. And so when we're thinking about how do we find some of the people that were in these communities, right? We actually went online. We talked to our networks. We looked for newspaper articles. We looked for mutual aid networks that had popped up post-flooding. We tried to find community-based organizations and even religious institutions and reached out to them to see if they could connect us with anyone from these communities that we may not have been a part of, particularly people who were already trusted community members. During our actual conversations with our lived experts, we wanted to make sure that we were making as many considerations for their time and their effort. And so we wanted to make sure that we were able to compensate them, which each recipient was, for their time. And again, we thank you all for just being a part of this process. But we also wanted to make sure people could speak in the native language that was sort of specific to them. And so Carrie and I actually went back and asked our project funders if they could get translators for us, and we were able to get connected with translators that are actually from one of the communities that participant recipients were living in. And so not only connection to community, but investing in that connection and in the people who are doing the work locally. And then, of course, we made sure that we were looking across time zones. As you see, we were talking to people across the nation. And so really wanted to make sure that we were being considerate of both Eastern and Pacific sort of time zones across each end. And so we actually ensured that our meetings were held not only online, but at night. And so we had most of our evening late in the evening to ensure that we could have participation from anyone who wanted to be a part of the conversation, sort of from New York to California. So I will stop on the process piece, Carrie, to allow you to ask our panelists some of the other questions we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shamika. Let's do a quick sound check for Joe and Jose, just to see if the mics have been fixed for the folks online.
Check.
Shamika, is that better? Can you hear both Jose and Joe?
I heard a check, but it wasn't very clear, and there's a lot of no's coming in, so I'm going to lean in on the other online participants.
We're just going to get cozy and we're all going to use this mic, so no problem. Okay, just speak right into this mic and I'll pass it over to you. Okay, if you have questions and you've written them down in your cards, please just wave them. Maggie will come by and pick them up. I'll get us started with the question while we wait for any to come our way. One of the things that was really fascinating when we had both our dialogue with the practitioners and our dialogues with the recipients was just the differences between the programs. So because we don't have some sort of centralized US buyout program, the buyout programs are run very differently in different places, even when they're not all funded by the same source, but many of them are funded by the same sources, and yet they play out very differently on the ground. And I wondered if Jose and Joe, if either of you or both of you wants to say anything about some of the interesting things you heard about the way the other programs operated, those different from the way that yours operated. Who wants to take that first?
Okay, I think that's a great question, because that was really a very important aspect of our buyouts. When we first were trying for the buyouts, and I was taught by two different areas that were going through buyouts at the time. I collaborated with Nature Conservancy in upstate New York and New York, and they were going through the hazard mitigation grant program. So when I was talking to the community, that's all we spoke about. So when we did talk to some officials as we were moving forward, they were like, we're not going to do it, it's going to take 5 years. But we just kept moving forward. And with the Speaker Council in the mayor, Christine Quinn, and she's toured the area, and she said it's really amazing because it's the first community in the nation, especially of the scope and magnitude. So she said to me, she said, Joe, it's really great that you guys are doing this, but you're not going to. Can you hear me right? It keeps kind of going. Okay. And she said, you need to go in a different direction. So she didn't say what it was, but she meant to go to the governor. So we went to the governor, and the governor had been going through the New York buyouts, and that had been taking forever. They were going through the Isaac and Irene buyouts in 2010, 2011, and they were still processing it. And these people needed the money, and they needed the money quickly, and it had to happen quickly. So the governor changed the program. He used the community development block program. And that program made one huge difference, especially for us in New York. So you really need a governor who knows what they're doing, actually, because he knew that. And the mayor and the governor really got around. I don't think anything to do with that, maybe a little bit. But in order to use the hazard mitigation grant program, you had to go through the city. The city council has 51 members. We have 3 in Staten Island. And every house had to pass through the city council on whether that was going to get bought out. We took it right from that program, put it into community development block program, which allowed you have to apply to the city anymore, because most of the problems that I heard in our discussions were the hazard mitigation grant program. It's an amazing program when you read it, but to implement it, it takes forever. And so because we were allowed to apply directly to the state, that cut out so much. So the governor, luckily, he ends up in a complete cycle, and he wanted to. He really is. I mean, but anyway, he wanted to. I felt it. But hey, John, this guy's going to do this. Let's give him what he wants. And we just teed it up for him, and we broke the record. it was less than 12 months from storm to buyout to demolition. And that was only because he changed the program. So that's a great question. And I know that that came up a lot, is that that process really does make a difference.
I'm gonna add on to it. Okay, so one story. There we go. All right. One story and two takeaways. I believe in our first meeting that we had on the buyback programs, that it was a collaborative with NRDC. Jeez, sorry, I'm off today. It was specific to the holy grail of what anybody who's done any buyback is, which is a turnkey operation. And a turnkey operation had community led, they came in, case managers, they went over appraisal, they moved the property, they accommodated people. If they were, for an example, if they were handicapped, they changed over their and did the renovations that were required in their new homes. All these things that had no ability to be transferred over to buybacks because it was specific to airports. And that was one of the two takeaways, which is increasing collaboration across all different sectors that you have in community-led organizations, as well as cities, municipalities, counties, regions, different things like water management districts. These allow for an ability to information gather and really try and find a way how you can implement that same type of innovation into what is applicable on your end. And that requires the second takeaway, which is create an interdisciplinary team. That is critical for to the same example of using CDBG funds. Sometimes there's conversations in rooms with either elected officials or directors or other people, and not one person knows everything that is available. And if you are able to bring in as many people as you can to at least share the mission, share the goal, that can lead to a successful input-driven initiative.
Thank you. Folks who are not here with us in the room, we're sorry that the sound is so tricky, but we are really trying to make it work. I am going to say a question that I want you to think about, Joe, for a second, okay? And Jose has a question here in front of him that he'll be thinking about, and then I'll answer one. I will ask Shamika to answer one. All right, Shamika, here's the question. How important was use of the land after? Did it matter to those receiving the buyouts? Is restoration happening for bigger long-term resilience and ecosystem benefits? So if you could talk a little bit about how folks talked about their concern for what happened with the land afterward, that'd be great. And that will give Joe and Jose a moment to think about their next questions.
So in short, yes, people did think about that. They did care about that. And one of the recommendations and one of the things that we heard was not only were people angry by the fact that they were in these places to begin with, but they wanted to make sure if they were giving up their homes and their communities and the lands that they've known and the places that they have built lives in, they want to make sure that if these communities are too risky for them to be in, they would not be places for future people to be put in. And so one of the main things we heard time and again was that the land should be returned to nature, whether that be used as a passive park or some other community benefit. The idea overall is that once people are bought out, folks should remain out of those floodplain areas.
Thank you, Shamika. You good to go, Jose?
Yeah.
Okay. Could you read the question also?
Absolutely. I'll try and answer it as best as I can. And if I don't, hunt me down. How do you reconcile or justify the continued growth of private real estate permitting with a need to relocate? How are you assuring that buyouts don't create a vacuum that continues to extract wealth, displace communities, and stress natural resources? Not to cop out, there are state statute requirements that for permitting. However, we can have higher regulatory standards, which we are constantly trying to implement and increase. Now, I think the most important thing from Miami's perspective is that managed retreat is not losing. we're not at war with the ocean. We're not at war with groundwater increase because we have a porous limestone. So we are learning to live with water. And if we are choosing to plan forward and reduce the risk of both property and people, that it's not something that we are, hey, this is a process we're packing up slowly and moving everybody off. That is critical for communities. It's critical for institutions, as I said earlier. We are trying to implement and look forward. We have studies, granted the studies need to be done every few years again, that show commensurate rise. So every 1 inch of sea level rise is a 1 inch in groundwater. That exacerbates a lot of issues for infrastructure as well as for private property. These are all requirements that we're instilling right now. And we hope, and that's there's it's a difficult problem with communities. Miami's not unique, but there are unique situations. So we have a climate gentrification problem that there are areas of Miami that are naturally higher ground that are a community of concern and lower income. And these communities are receiving development pressure so when we are promoting as far as kind of the risks that we have to make sure that we are not moving a community, because that community, no matter where they move, in Miami anyway, they are going to be moving to a higher risk location, because right now they are in the best position that they can be. And that's an important aspect whenever we're talking about development and retreat and communities.
Thank you. I'm going to answer a question that came through that says, can we possibly build enough trust with underrepresented communities without openly and directly confronting the centuries of reasons that these communities often mistrust government, academia, and other institutions? And I am just going to read one paragraph from the white paper, because I just want you to know that we did address this and give you the chance to go look at it and see the very specific policies that we suggested. So, and this came from the conversation with the buyout managers, not from the conversation with the buyout recipients. So I want that to be underscored, because the buyout managers, the people running these programs, really understand how important this is and find themselves limited in their ability to do it as well as they would like. So it says staff should understand how historical inequities have contributed to the unequal distribution of vulnerability in their community, and how the prioritization of lower wealth communities for buyouts can be experienced by the members of these communities as yet another target on their backs, rather than the benefit it appears to be from a pure hazard mitigation perspective. If residents perceive that the buyout program staff are ignorant or unfeeling about these forces beyond the residents' control, they may justifiably lack trust in the program, making it harder for those who might benefit from a buyout to even consider or explore it. And then we have a series of specific policies and procedures that, beyond simply raising awareness, make all the difference when you go into a community that has every reason to think that you're just coming in to relocate them yet again. All right, Joe, let's pass over to that question. You could read it first.
Sure. And just a quick note about how the importance of what you do with the property afterwards. We ended up advocating for 550 people in Staten Island that participate in the buyouts. And by far, the biggest question that they had is what are they going to do with the property? They all thought they were going to build McMansions, and they would not participate if that were the case. So they do want to know. And then unfortunately, we built soccer fields where they are. So, I mean, I guess that's okay. It's better than McMansions, but it's not the wetlands and stuff like that you thought that they would do, storm retention tanks and stuff like that. So I think it's a really important, if not the most important. Okay, here's the question. Regarding having realtors in the room or on the projects, what other types of professionals, practitioners, experts, et cetera, should we be engaging in this work? And the two that come to mind is number one, probably appraisers. because that's what we did in ours as well. Because when you go through the buyouts, when it's a buyout and not managed retreat, you have the opportunity to challenge your appraisal because the state's going to give you an appraisal. So what I did is, through my sources, I came up with 2 different appraisers that I gave to the community that they all started to use. And that really built a lot of confidence, because when they knew they had an appraiser that was on their side, not hired by the state, because there's so many rumors that can totally derail a buyout process. And one of the rumors is that, the state hired this appraiser to give you low values because they want to, it's just awful. But by having this appraiser, that was really important. So I think when you start the process, that's one of the people that you need to engage in the process so they can help with the valuations. And the other is an attorney. Everybody, most people, especially homeowners, will have an attorney that's trusted. So whether it's engaging the individual's attorneys or getting an attorney to sort of represent the group, I think that would probably be good. When you have community meetings, have attorneys there that can help them through the process. Especially, I talked a little bit about in my opening about closing costs. The attorneys can talk about that, but I think in a managed retreat scenario that the closing costs have to be addressed, especially in New York City, because the mortgage recording tax is 3%. So if they sell their house and they buy another one and they record that mortgage, that's another 3% added cost. So that should be picked up by the state or whoever. But I think those 2 would be very important.
Thanks, Joe. And I'll just add that we, in addition to sort of the real estate transaction itself, that having trauma-informed case managers, having grief-informed case managers, and in a situation where an entire community is trying to decide whether they at the same time should relocate and thinking about what will be there when we're gone, people who can help them think through what kind of legacy markers might we leave here. So people with artists, for example, people who think about how to memorialize places that have had meaning for people, and they are literally sacrificing for the good of others, are other kinds of folks that are useful and meaningful to bring into these conversations. There are a couple more questions that we didn't get to. I'm sorry about that, but we do want to move into some small group conversations. Given the way this room is set up, I'm going to make one recommendation. All the folks at the back, when we break, either make a little group, I guess, a standing group, or just come join one of these tables. As we mentioned, there are extra chairs around here, and I would love for you to be able to be in the conversation. Anna, can we put up those questions? Okay, while Anna's putting up the questions, I want to say a huge thank you to Shamika. Thank you, Shamika. And can we have a round of applause for Shamika? Shamika was all set to come this morning and then got that dreaded COVID test. So she was on her way. And Jose, thank you so much for coming up from Florida. Thank you. And Joe, we really appreciate you making the trek from Staten Island. All right. Thank you guys. So we encourage you to really choose any of these questions that are useful to you. We know how this goes. You sit on the table and you go around and then you have 2 minutes left anyway. So there may not be a ton of conversation, but we encourage you to try to talk about one of these 3 prompts when you get in your, in your group. So, did you learn something from this session that will change how you do the work? Are there 1 or 2 things that you could imagine happening in your community or your institution that would enable some of the changes that you heard here, some of the recommendations that came either from the practitioners or from the buyout recipients? Or what are some benefits and challenges that you can name of including both learned and lived experts in these kinds of conversations? There are pros and cons on both sides, so it's interesting to hear your thoughts on that. So if you are online, I am going to trust that the online people are figuring out how to do this. And if you're here in this room, then just find your way to a table. Feel free to stand up and move to another table if you'd like to meet some new folks. But we'll do this until about 25 after, and then we just have a couple of closing remarks at the end. Thanks. Okay. Before we hear from a couple of you, Joe mentioned that if you want to learn more about the buyout process and project that he ran. You can look at the website, foxbeach165.com. I'm sorry, we didn't think to include it in the slides, but foxbeach165.com. Okay, would anyone like to share? Any thoughts on something you learned today? Yeah, Chris.
We had a great conversation at our table, and one of the things that we centered on most was the importance of risk disclosure. We can have all these conversations about the buyout program, but really we need to get honest about investment in this country and maybe in Canada too. And be honest about risk disclosure. Where did Carrie go? And she's gone. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Anything you want to share? Yeah.
Something that I'm taking away is that we think about buyouts as a hazard mitigation tool, but buyouts are pretty much about everything else in society. They're about trust and past inequities and harm that the government caused and how we can work with that and rectify it. How it's about the real estate market and housing costs and housing unaffordability and interest rates. And so buyouts intersect with pretty much everything, all the other challenges in society, and they're a housing program, and they're not a hazard mitigation program necessarily.
Absolutely. The fact that it lives in the risk management space makes it so difficult to deal with all of the things that matter if you're the person at risk. And you're like, I'm not a risk that needs to be managed. I'm a person with a home and a family and a community and jobs and all those things. And that makes it really challenging under a risk management framework. How about someone back here? I'll come to you. Anyone over here? Okay, that's cool. That's fine. That's fine. I'll look this direction. Anyone want to share? It's a real friendly crowd. Ah, I walked exactly the wrong direction.
So I'll just try one, engage the social scientists, absolutely. But one thing I wish we could be careful with our language of saying things about what all the communities have done wrong. Because yeah, we've made some mistakes, but a lot of these places that are vulnerable have been developed for 300 and 400 years. We didn't do it all wrong. And planners aren't the bad guys. So I just would like us to remember that this is an unprecedented, accelerating challenge that we're facing now in the last 50 years that is accelerating now remarkably. And that's a blip across 400 years of development in this country. So just a thought.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Anyone else? We have like a minute. Okay. Well, I will direct you to this QR code. We are really interested in hearing more. Not everyone is comfortable speaking in a big room like this, but your thoughts are genuinely valued. As I mentioned before, and as Anna said, NRDC, the Climigration Network, myself, others, we are deeply invested in this topic and learning from you and other thoughts, ideas, questions that you might have. We would love to hear them and would love to integrate them into the work. Anna, is there anything you want to say before we close? You're good. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Columbia, and our big old tech team back there. That's been wonderful. Thank you so much. Have a good day.